Is it live?
Yep.
Oh, never refreshed for me. Okay. Twitch is good. And YouTube sounds good. Join us, 125, Ego Chall Podcast, CDL Awards, Free Agent Clayster, and more.
You ready to get started?
Yep.
Hello, and welcome to episode 125 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have a very notable free agent in the Call of Duty League, and we're going to go through our ballots for CDL MVP, Rookie of the Year, and All-Stars. Bink is actually voting this year, as he did last year, so we're going to go through it on this podcast. Try to hash out maybe some of the disagreements that we have and try to get some clarity on who should be on the All-Star ballot. And maybe we'll talk about some champ stuff briefly at the end of the show as well. But before we do any of that, how you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Yeah, not much going on, and felt a little weird not having COD this week, and knowing we, we've had breaks before, but just like knowing that there's only one event with champs coming up, it felt a little weird not having any COD to watch. But yeah, we're getting to champs, and before we get to the big preview show next week, we figured we'd throw one more live show together, and obviously we had some stuff go down, like Preston mentioned, so should have some good stuff to talk about. So hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, so Roster Mania is kind of kicking off a little bit already. The biggest news, Clayster, who we had discussed over the past few weeks, leading up to the final major of the CDL season, that possibly this is the last event that we would see Clayster at, and potentially Esports World Cup, which is in Saudi Arabia next month. Maybe that would be the last event. This week, or yesterday, Clayster announced that he is a free agent. He has been released by the Carolina Royal Ravens and will be a free agent for the Esports World Cup, which I don't know if it's necessarily surprising that some of the teams are kind of making some changes, and I think we've seen some rumors about possibly what the Boston Breaches roster is going to be at the Esports World Cup, but we do have confirmation that Carolina will at least be making this change with Clayster. So your overall thoughts on this? He's obviously one of the best Call of Duty players of all time. He's kind of one of the icons of the esport. But at this point in his career, we always have to be a little cautious about whether this is kind of like the last thing that we see from Clayster in Call of Duty esports.
Yeah, I think we kind of briefly touched on some of the teams that didn't make champs at the end of last week's episode. So if you guys didn't catch that, go ahead and check that out. But the one thing I said last week is that it feels like priority one for Carolina has to be retaining Glenn. Glenn had a pretty good year, and it felt like when he didn't play well, Carolina didn't have a chance in a lot of series. But when he did play well, that Carolina had a much better chance and actually saw some positive results with some key victories here and there. So when, again, it's speculation, but assuming a team like Carolina, who was previously like the London organization, and, we don't have a ton of information on their spending habits and stuff, but it's a pretty safe assumption that Gwyn was most likely on a somewhat, minimum or rookie level contract that wasn't incredibly lucrative like some of these other contracts that we've reportedly heard over the years. So from a business standpoint and just based on how he performed, it would make sense that priority one for Carolina should be to retain him. Whereas some of these teams at champs, if they decide to some of the more the contenders, the top four teams, if they stumble at champs and decide to make a move, he's one of those players they could try to potentially like poach or go after, right? So I felt like in my eyes that was priority one for Carolina, and then after that it was going to be addressing Clayster and seeing whether they wanted to keep him around or if they wanted to go in a different direction. And obviously, as it turns out, they are addressing that right away and moving on from Clay. And I think really just in the CDL era, I mean, obviously there's for a long time COD esports fans, there's the whole like denial situation with him back in 2015, like throw me to the wolves and I'll come back leading the pack or whatever his quote was when they won champs and they weren't really expected to. Um, this the story of his career in recent years. I mean, not even as far back, but just since the CDL really has been like 1 year with a team and moving on to the next. And obviously, the first year in the CDL, it wasn't necessarily indicative of his performance or anything. It was the swap from 5v5 back to 4v4. They win champs with Dallas Empire. He's the the unfortunate casualty there in terms of cutting down the roster size from 5 to 4. But since then, I mean, he's really just, he's gone from the Empire to Subliners and then Vegas Legion last year and now Carolina this year. So he really hasn't had an opportunity to stay with a team for more than a year, which leading up to that CDL era when he was on FaZe and he was on E United, he was, able to build something with those teams, he won some championships. He has a big fan base, all that stuff we've talked about for years with Clay. Um, so yeah, it's a decision obviously to play devil's advocate, talking about Gwynn's contract situation. Clayster's contract situation is likely much different and much likely more on the expensive side just because of the pedigree, three-time world champion. He can demand a higher salary just because of who he is, what he's accomplished, and what he's capable of. It's just going to be a question of now is what he's going to do next, if this is really going to be it, or if he's going to be able to find a way onto another team. He did tweet after he tweeted his free agency status. Any opportunities outside of playing Bang My Line, literally open to anything at this point. Think it might be time. Then Embos had a funny response and said, "This how you announce it, LOL, after all these years. Yeah, F you, buddy." And Clay said this last year too, buddy, just seeing what my options are. So he's definitely not announcing retirement like that, but it is definitely in that situation now where he's at least, weighing his options, thinking about what the future could look like for Clay. And obviously, I know how much you like him as a player and even as a person. I, think very highly of Clay too, wishing him the best. And, it's just going to come down to it's. This does feel like, similar to the Empire situation that I alluded to in terms of, that was literally the day after they won champs. This was almost like a couple days after Carolina's season ended. And, I've obviously not been a professional player in Clay's situation like that. But if I was going to get dropped or released from my contract in a situation like that, I would like it to be very early on because now he's got the entire next couple months ahead of him to, weigh his options, talk to teams, talk to GMs, etc., and try and figure out what the future looks like for him. So again, not a situation he obviously wants to be in. I'm not very confident, but I'm sure he wouldn't have mind getting a chance to, stay with Carolina for another season and continue to build on what they tried to accomplish this year. But end of the day, Carolina's moving on, and now we'll just have to see what the future holds for Mr. Eubanks.
Clayster's career is just, like you alluded to, is kind of fascinating. He's had a really hard time sticking long term with teams. He's not like Scump, who's spent nearly his entire like adult life with Optic, or even Krim, like, who is notoriously temperamental. He's was a difficult teammate to get along with. As you can see from various interactions he's had over the years. But even Krim had a very long stint, with Complexity EG and then with Optic, of course. But Clay hasn't had that like kind of stability that a lot of other top level, like, top five players in Call of Duty history have had. I'm not exactly sure why that is. If maybe that's an indication of something with him, or if that's just kind of wrong place, wrong time, sort of circumstances for him. But I want to bring up what he said before this season. So when he signed with Carolina, I believe it was when he signed with Carolina. Maybe this was a little bit before he ended up with the Royal Ravens. But he said that this might be his last season, especially if he couldn't stick with the team and he had to find a new team in the offseason. So, and obviously he's in that situation again. Like you mentioned, he's been going team to team pretty much every single year for the last several years. And I'm sure that's very draining. And eventually you're going to run out of teams that are interested. Granted, I do think it should be mentioned that expansion would definitely help out Clay a lot, because there is very few expansion teams or organizations that would turn down Clayster and the opportunity to have one of the best Call of Duty players of all time, one of the most popular and most well-liked players in the entire league. That's kind of something that he can, not necessarily as from a competitor standpoint. I'm sure that he would love to stick on a team, just based on his performance and whatnot. And he did allude to the fact that maybe he needs to be more selfish, and I'm sure that plays into some kind of dynamics within Carolina, because we've seen that year over year from players who end up getting released, that they say, I should be more selfish, I should play for stats more, because that's what people are looking at when they're making these roster changes, or that's what fans are looking at, or whoever. I think it's interesting that it definitely could be the last time that we see Clayster play. He could, officially retire this offseason. But Esports World Cup kind of throws a wrench into some of these plans as well, because it is an off-season tournament, and it's a big off-season tournament, to the point that these CDL teams are probably they can make roster changes specifically for this tournament and then completely change their direction when it comes to their roster afterward, because it's not like whatever team you have at the Esports World Cup is something that you have to stick with as you go into the next season of the CDL. That can be completely different. So Clayster, him being a free agent for the Esports World Cup, doesn't necessarily mean that he will be a free agent when it's time for the next CDL season to begin. But yeah, it sucks to see him kind of like this, but we see this with almost every single top level Call of Duty player. Scump is like kind of an anomaly, because he kind of went out when he was still really, really good, and he wasn't showing much decline at all. And you can't say that for Clayster, you can't say that for Crim6 and Karma and some of the other like really great players. Sometimes they hang on a little bit too long, and I'm not saying that Clay is, because he's been on the edge of making champs each of the last 2 years, like heartbreaking, last minute opportunities that don't go his way. But it's obviously pretty frustrating from, I'm sure, his standpoint. So it's I'm very interested to see what he's going to do this offseason, either way, what he does.
Yeah, you can probably make the argument that the other player that stepped away before necessarily a decline or anything would be Octane, right? And if you had told me a couple years back like Clay would still be competing and Octane wouldn't, I probably would be pretty surprised. So it's definitely something to consider. Like, does he want to go out now? Selfishly, I would definitely like to see him get another title, or at least compete at champs one more time. But yeah, there's a ton of outside factors and everything like that too. But definitely agree with what you said about expansion. If we don't know after the mid-season announcement this year what's going to happen with the league, if we're going to even get expansion. But putting on a pretend GM hat here, if I was a GM for an imaginary expansion team coming into the league, and similar to the Boston situation a couple years back, where all these other teams have signed players, and you're coming into a situation where you got to make a decision based on the players available. You know, spending a little bit more hypothetical money on Clay, surrounding him with 3 rookies on potentially cheaper scholarships, does not sound like a terrible strategy to me. But that's all speculation. I mean, end of the day, we're gonna have to actually see expansion before we can even talk about that.
Yeah, and they're gonna have to be, obviously champs is gonna have to come and go before teams really start to make these big decisions. Like a team like Optic, obviously I don't think Clayster is in the running for an Optic spot, but Optic's roster, they're kind of combustible because if they get top 8 necessarily at champs, then that team is very likely going to have to break up, or not have to, but I think they are likely to make a change or 2 changes or whatnot, where that kind of has a domino effect where Optic makes a change. So does FaZe decide to make a change, or does Toronto make a change, and they have to retain their players, and then that leaves open spots for a player like Clayster to figure out where his next destination is. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. It would be fun to see Clay back at champs, and it would be fun to see him kind of mentor 2 or 3 young guys again, because he has shown success multiple times in doing so. But we'll have to see. We'll have to wait on that, and maybe we'll get that sometime during this off season. But yeah, that's what is going on for at least the free agency stuff. I didn't really see anything other, rumors and whatnot, but I'm not sure if you had anything that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, just real quick, I forgot to put it in here just until you mentioned it, but there was CDL Scrim Intel on Twitter reporting on July 5th that Boston Breach's potential roster for the Esports World Cup was going to be Cammy, Arcity, Purge, and Snoopy. Another topic that we briefly hit on at the end of last episode was Boston heading into 2025. Would they just decide to completely blow it up, or hold on to Snoopy and build around him, or hold on to Snoopy, put him in challengers, and make a new roster? They have a bunch of directions they can go in. I know Purge, I believe, tweeted like an emoji or something to suggest this wasn't necessarily true. So some speculation around that, but potentially we will potentially get a new Boston Breach roster at the Esports World Cup. At the same time, CDL Scrim Intel also tweeted that Linz and Gunless are potentially a team of 2 for the rocker for the Esports World Cup. So nothing officially announced. Obviously, Clayster's free agency was officially announced by him and Carolina. Not the case with these other 2 teams for Boston and Minnesota, but something to keep an eye on, and potentially something for us to talk more about as we learn more over the coming weeks and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean the Boston team is going to be, they're going to get something from the community on that, just simply because Snoopy is a part of it, allegedly or whatever. I also think it's interesting that Cammy has found his way. If this is an accurate roster, he's had obviously a really rough go the last 2 or so seasons, and I'm interested to see if he's been able to kind of bounce back, or if he is able to bounce back with a team like Boston. But I mean, they're the eyes are definitely going to be on them regardless, but especially if Snoopy is on that team, then everybody's going to be looking at them, making sure that they made the wrong decision or whatnot. I also did see the thing that you linked in the notes about accuracy. He was seen in the Optic team chat and potentially being a coach for Optic during or in the lead up to champs, which it seems like a sin on accuracy's part to be helping out a team that he has broken the hearts of on multiple occasions. But
Maybe it's his redemption arc in the eyes of the Green Wall.
Maybe. But accuracy is obviously a very good search and destroy player. One of the more clutch players that I've seen, at least. And he's been around COD for so long and been playing at a really high level and in the CDL for numerous years. So I'm sure having that kind of point of view from like an opponent's point of view, from a person who has played against this specific Optic team this year, that probably does have some benefit. What do you think of it?
I mean, look, even if accuracy wasn't like considered the Iceman or a really clutch search player or anything like that, like this team has lost, I think, what we said, 12 S&Ds in a row heading into champs now,
Yeah.
something ridiculous like that. Like, it really can't hurt to get anyone's opinion on what they can do potentially in search. Now, obviously, it's unofficial if accuracy is even helping or anything, and it would just be speculation if he's helping them in search.
Hmm.
We could help them in multiple modes or just be, an extra set of eyes on things there. But regardless of the situation, we don't know much. But if this is true, that accuracy is helping them, I think it is a good sign for Optic that they are being proactive and trying to, you know, it would be very easy for a lot of teams, not necessarily Optic, just due to their fandom and popularity. But a lot of teams in the CDL, it would be easy for them to just be like, yeah, we're struggling right now, and then chance we're just gonna pack it in, show up, and do what we can, right? But to see Optic potentially putting in that extra effort, trying to figure out some stuff, um, that's got to be a good sign. And at the same time, we could be looking too far into this as a community. Could just be actually joined a Discord call or whatever just to shoot the shit with the boys, right? Like, we don't really know. And at 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 the least, this is a positive sign for Optic from like the green wall and the community perspective. Even if it is a case of accuracy, just popping in to say hi to the boys, like if he's not helping them at all, now the community thinks like he's potentially helping, and that could have people thinking similarly to me, like, oh, nice Optics putting in that work trying to figure things out ahead of champs. um so yeah, I know the green wall is probably hopeful that it's a case of actually helping out in search to try and uh reverse course here and figure things out, but we'll have to wait and see till next week.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about our ballots. All Star, Rookie of the Year, MVP. You, like I mentioned at the top of the show, you are actually voting, and you're part of the voting for these awards. I think you said the media voting makes up for 25% of the overall voting. So even if all of us or all of the media were to vote for specific players, fan voting and whatnot can come into play and change that. And so let's get into it. Do you want to start All Star, Rookie, or MVP first?
Let's start with all stars. Yeah, but so based on what I was sent, talent and media combine for 25% of the all star vote. The remainder of the vote comes from fans, players, and GM slash coaches. So it's not, it's definitely multiple people putting in their thoughts here. Um, and I think this year in particular is a little tougher in terms of yeah, I feel like in years past, even when we weren't like officially voting or anything, it felt like there was a lot more clear cut answers, just due to like, certain teams winning more championships. That was something you could factor in. That you got a player who's won multiple championships in a year versus a player who hasn't. You can potentially give them the nod for that reason. Same time, that this time this year we have the top four all with one championship each. So it's going to be a question for a lot of people, including myself. How do you balance, a across the board either one championship or no championship with individual stats? Um, so for all stars, you, they are asking you to vote for four AR and four SMG players in no particular order. Um, the top two ARs and the top two SMGs will make up like the first team All Star team. Third through four AR, third through four SMG will make up the second All Star team. I believe they did
Mm-hmm.
it the same way last year, potentially the year before, but I'm not 100% sure on the way the All Star worked out. But regardless, that's what we're looking at right now. Um, and where my head is at right now, I feel like there's some clear cut candidates for All Stars, and the one that I am kind of, I guess, struggling the most with personally is just that fourth spot for AR and fourth spot for SMG, probably more so fourth spot for AR. That's the one I'm really torn about right now. But I think for ARs, I've got Celium, Scrappy, Dashy, and Sib down right now. Sib is the one um, I'm not entirely sold on. I'm also considering Attach and Ghosty, as I was talking to you just before we went live. Um, and then SMG, Simp, Hydra, Kleenex, and Abeezy. I think that's kind of straightforward. I think you could potentially argue some other people like possibly Pred or Shotzi for the fourth SMG shot spot over Abeezy, but I think Simp and Hydra are a lock for uh, first team All Star. I think Celium and Scrap are a lock for first team All Star AR, and I think like that third, fourth spot for both AR and SMG is where it can kind of get a little dicey, and that's where it kind of opens up for conversation in my eyes.
Yeah, and things have kind of rapidly changed over the last month or so because Pred has had like kind of a pretty poor end to the season, but I'm sure there were definitely people that would. I'm sure he will still get votes. I'm sure, but
Yes.
Before the major four qualifiers, I think he would have been a lot higher. Maybe some of the other optic guys would have been a lot higher because of kind of like how things were shaping up at that time. But then New York ends on such a strong note. And I don't think it was ever really in doubt that someone like Hydra was going to make it because he was obviously the best player on that team, and they were one of the top four teams all season long. But I don't. Maybe Sib doesn't get as much consideration if New York doesn't have the strong finish to the season. Maybe some of the optic guys get bumped up a little bit more. And because teams didn't make it to champs, like Attach, like he was with the Las Vegas Legion, they didn't make it to champs. If you had to turn in your ballot before Major Four, maybe that would have changed because you wouldn't know. Maybe Vegas could make champs, and you're thinking, okay, like I think Attach deserves it, because he is one of the top ARs or whatnot. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation about whether the standings matter or how much they matter in the end.
Yeah.
That's something, in traditional sports, specifically with something like Rookie of the Year, a lot of people don't take into consideration how good your team is because, that's not something that you can control a lot of times, or you have a lot less control of. Victor Wembanyama, I think I mentioned this on last episode or maybe 2 episodes ago, but he was so good despite the Spurs being so bad, and people were like, yeah, it's still a no-brainer. Like, even with Chet Holmgren being very good and the Thunder being very good, it didn't mean anything, and, people still voted for Wembanyama, and rightfully so. You have the same kind of situation with Rookie of the Year and with All-Stars and MVP. Where do you go in regards to that? I think Ghosty is a really interesting conversation because of that, because he was by far the best player on the Los Angeles Thieves this year. I think he was the most underrated free agent acquisition of last offseason. Of course, when you sign, Pred and Kenny, and you sign Draza, and you bring in like high level talent like that for a championship team, I think obviously that's going to get more attention from fans and whatnot. But Ghosty was the best player for LAT, and I think that he deserves like really strong consideration for an all-star spot. He's going to be on the bubble, of course, because like you mentioned, Cell and Scrap have locked up the top 2 AR spots. So it comes down to whether you believe it's Dashy, who has had an incredible season, was on one of the best teams in the league. They won a major. Whether you go with someone like Sib, who I think was a little more up and down this year, as was his team. They, obviously they were last place at the first major They won the last major, so that kind of gives you a good indication. And then you have Attach and Ghosty, who are both on teams that were kind of struggling all year long to find any consistency, but they were the best players for their team. So I'm curious how you are kind of weighing that.
And that doesn't even throw Draza's name into the conversation.
Yeah, and I was thinking about him too.
And the tough thing for me, I haven't turned in my vote or anything, so I'm hoping talking through this with you, we can come to figure out some of these minor details. But if I was to vote for all 4 members of FaZe to be all stars, I just don't know how I would feel about that, because it's not a case where, like, if this is Cold War phase where they were dominant and they won multiple titles, like, yeah, you can make that argument, but it's not a case like that this year. They have the same number of titles as every other team that won an event. So really tough for that last spot there. So I think that's the argument for Sib is, he has a title and is potentially, like, from a statistical standpoint, he's just a slightly ahead of Skies, as the highest KD. Sib has a 1.05 overall KD this season. Skies has a 1.04, so it's not a huge difference or anything, but as the two AR representatives for New York, and New York just won the last event, I feel like having one of them on that team is a decent shout. The argument for Attach would be he has the 5th highest overall KD this season in a 1.1. Conversation against him would be Vegas isn't at champs. For Ghosty, like you said, I think that's like really a question of, LAT had multiple roster iterations this year. It felt like even when they were losing, he was playing really well. I can remember specifically, like, the first major of the year, him and Slasher both had like 1.4 KDs for major 1 because they only played in one series and they lost. And they dropped 1.4s in those losses, so they had like the highest KDs for the tournament. That's kind of like, in a little indicative of, when LAT was playing well, Ghosty was playing well, but at the same time when LAT was struggling, Ghosty was still, standing out as a star player. So I definitely, if anybody said to me they voted for Ghosty and as an all-star, I definitely get the argument for it, and it's definitely something I'm weighing. I just don't really know how, at least weighing the options between him and Attach, how much do you value Ghosty and LAT making champs over Attach having a slightly higher KD but not making champs? And at the same time, how do you value both of them not having a championship over Sib and Draza, who have actually won an event this year?
Yeah, and I think it just all depends on what you're looking for in these all stars, because if this is MVP voting, obviously they're going to be kind of cast to the side because their teams weren't nearly as good, but their value to their respective teams is so great that you can't ignore it. If even if Boston had the season that they did, but say Snoopy had this ridiculous run where he was kind of just carrying them and they just still couldn't get over the hump, you would have to even like put him in a conversation. And obviously LAT and Vegas were much better than a team like Boston was this year. But back to your point about 4 players from FaZe or whatever being on these all-star teams, I just looked up the last 2 seasons of all-stars, and two players from a single team, that it seems to be about the maximum for what it ends up being. Of course, you can vote for all 4 players from a team. But in 2022, Seattle had 2 players, Optic had 2 players, Atlanta had 2 players, and then New York and Minnesota each had a single player on the all-star teams. And then last year, Optic and FaZe each had 2, and then you had Toronto, New York, Seattle, and LAT each have 1. And I think that's probably going to be the case for this year, where you get FaZe, they get 2. Maybe Optic gets 2 just from simply the fan vote and how
Yeah.
much that weighs in. I'd be shocked if they didn't get 2. And then it depends on what we see from New York. Like New York's obviously going to get 1. Toronto is obviously going to get 1 with Hydra and Scrap respectively. But I I'm interested to see if it could be something like 4 teams, like the top 4 teams represented by 2 players each. I think that is a possibility, although I'm a little skeptical that you know either Toronto or New York could pull it off with a fan vote, especially with so many other good players in the league. But yeah, I agree with you that Celium, or I was actually looking at your last year's ballot from our old our old notes, and you were looking at Celium, Dashi, Octane, Skies or Hydra, Pred, Abizi, and Shotzi and Simp. Which kind of lined up with who made it. Obviously, Simp did not make All-Stars last year, which is, that's surprising just in hindsight. It was Abizi and Celium. But this year, obviously, we're looking at Celium and Scrap, our locks for the ARs, Simp and Hydra.
I think so.
I would, I think as well. And I just think from if you look at talent, those are players that they're going to value. If you look at media, they're going to value them. And obviously the fellow players and coaches and fans, they're going to value them as well. So I think at least half of the All-Stars are locks for this year. And I would say that Dashi and or Shotzi, one of them, just simply from a van vote perspective, that they are the 2 most popular Optic guys. One of them is guaranteed a spot. So that locks up. I think it's probably Dashi this year because I don't think the sentiment is as strong against Dashi this season as it has been in past seasons. Good for him. And then I think FaZe is there's a chance that FaZe gets another one. Abizi is a super popular player. He was a first team All-Star last year. It's very difficult to discern the value of certain FaZe players because they fit so well together. I don't see Toronto necessarily getting another player, although I definitely think that there's a really good argument for a player like Kleenex. And obviously you love Kleenex, and he's literally one of the best players in the league. But I'm not entirely sure where we go from there.
So the one thing I will throw out too, just for everyone's reminder, the MVPs for the individual tournaments this year, Kleenex was the MVP at Major 1, Simp was the MVP at Major 2, Shotzi was the MVP at Major 3, and obviously Hydra was the Major 4 MVP. So if, again, in this scenario where we have teams with the same number of titles, how much do you value a single tournament MVP in terms of voting for an All-Star? It would make sense if that's factored in as well. And I think that works in Kleenex's favor if it is something that some people consider. And I also think it's something that could help Shotzi despite Optic struggles. Again, kind of like you said, I think fan vote should help Shotzi, Dashi, and potentially Pred get in there, at least one of them, if not 2. But yeah, I do think individual MVPs for the tournaments this year should be factored in. It's just a question of how much individual voters consider that.
Yeah, I think if it were entirely up to me, I think FaZe would get 2, Toronto would get 2, and then Optic and New York would each get 1 All-Star each. And that's more so just Toronto and Atlanta were the more consistent teams. And, like you said, Kleenex was MVP of the first major, and they were incredible at the first major, the Ultra. But Scrap was the best player for Toronto this season. And then with FaZe, Simp got the MVP. It could very easily be argued that Celium has been even better than Simp, and that's not a slight on Simp at all. Those are 2 of the top 5 best players in the entire league. So I think those 2 get in. And then Optic has been inconsistent. Obviously, recently they were very strong for most of the season, but it can't be ignored what's happened over the past month and a half. And it can't be ignored for New York what happened at the beginning of the season with their really disappointing performance at Major One. So that all can be taken into account. My I think I've come to the conclusion about who is going to be in my ARs at least. I think Celium and Scrap, like I said, are very easily going to get in. I would also say Dashi would be the Optic representative. And then I'm going to go with Ghosty because I think, it's not a huge gap between someone like him, Attach, Draza, Sib, in regards to like individual play. Of course, the team performances have been varying for each of those four players, but I think Ghosty has been, one of the better players, and I think he should be commended and rewarded for that kind of performance.
I like it.
Subs is a little more difficult because of those last two spots. I also have kind of that trepidation about putting in more than two phase guys in particular because they're really, I think, the team that is most likely to have that problem. And they've had that kind of problem for years because they've had Celium, Simp, and Abizi this entire time. And we always kind of have to pick, one or two of the three. But yeah, I think Simp Hydra very easily. I would probably say Kleenex as the third sub, kind of sticking to Toronto having two players on the ballot, and then probably, oh man, I'm not entirely sure on the fourth one yet. Who are you thinking about for submachine gun players for these all stars?
I'm in the same boat with Simp Hydra essentially locked in. Kleenex is my third choice. And then I was leaning Abizi. Definitely think you can make the argument for Shotzi, especially, like I said, MVP for Optic when they were in consideration for best team in the game. So I think that's up for consideration. At the same time, Pred has the sixth highest KD on the season, tied with Draza at 1.08. So, Pred could be another potential option there. And you could go with Gwen, technically, if you think, I think both times Rookie of the Year made the All-Star team because I know Scrap did last year and I think Pred did his first year. Those are the only two official Rookie of the Years, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's like a kind of, I feel like Gwen is like, not a super far out there pick, but I feel like he's like behind Abizi, Shotzi, and Pred and as potential candidates for the fourth spot.
Yeah. I think out of the options, like Abizi is probably the easiest one to put. But I would probably say Abizi just for the lack of like, it seems like it's a little more of a difficult decision with ARs and like there are more high caliber ARs that could be slot into the All-Star versus SMG. I think the list is a little bit smaller, and there's a lot of crossover with Optic and Toronto and FaZe, and I think the stats would never say it, but Kismet obviously needs like a special shout out because he's very likely never going to have the stats to kind of prove that. But his impact on the game is such that you definitely could argue that he is deserving of an all-star spot.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to rookie in a little bit here, but based on what we saw too, just for SMGs, like someone like Real, like if he had a full season with Heritex, or even if he had a full season with Carolina and didn't have those visa issues, would he be someone that we could potentially have in this conversation? That's obviously a what if, but I definitely agree with you. I think it's a little harder for the last AR spot than the last sub spot, but there's definitely arguments to be made for all of them, and that's just in indication of how competitive the league is nowadays, just how much talent there is. And to be clear, we've kind of been talking about like locking up spots and whatnot in terms of ranking these players. Even if as we're going through this, like saying like Sib and Hydra is 1-2, like that doesn't mean anything. Just means we're voting for them, and they could end up being third, fourth if let's just say Shotzi and Pred get a ton of votes, like they could potentially be 1-2. So the order in which voting for the players doesn't matter for all stars.
Yeah, and um, I think like the biggest thing that I've struggled with was you know trying to pick too many people from one team or trying not to
Yeah.
pick. And I think in an ideal world, like I said earlier, that it would be two phase, two Toronto, and then whatever Optic and New York get each a player, and then we'll see what happens with those last two spots. But I think like if it's between Abizi, Shotzi, and Pred for like a last submachine gun spot, like it is for at least me, and I would assume as you as well. Um, like I think I value Abizi's impact more, and I think consistency plays a factor, and I think recency bias also could be playing a big factor as well because if if Optic had struggled like they are right now at the beginning of the season and they finished on a really strong note, I think they're given the benefit of the doubt, right? We might be, or I might be singing a different tune about Optic if they were so strong at the moment, but they're not, and I don't know how to kind of ignore that necessarily because they're struggling so much, and it's not like there's two or three players that are like, man, they're still really really performing really well, but like they're losing to really bad teams, and I don't think I can ignore that, at least when it comes to all-star voting, when it's the best of the best. You're kind of comparing Shotzi and Pred to a player like Abizi, who is an MVP caliber player, almost every single year. So I think that's where I'm struggling.
And I do think, end of the day, this conversation might not even matter in the long run. That I very easily could see
Yeah.
Pred and or Shotzi both making uh, the All Star team, just again due to the Optic effect and the fandom and popularity of Optic. So, um, yeah, definitely not a knock on those guys to
No.
put a BZ on there. In my eyes, it's not the way I'm looking at it. Very similar to Ghosty, like you said. Like I am fully on board with, giving him a shout with an All Star vote. I can see the argument for having him on there, see the argument for not having him on there. And same with these Optic guys, but especially I think Shotzi's a little more likely to be an All Star than Pred. Again, got that MVP, 4 Major 3. Had a really strong performance there when arguably, well, I don't even think it's arguably, when Optic was playing its best COD of the year. Um, so if you're the MVP for potentially the best team at any period of the year, that's got to be at least all-star worthy to some degree.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, I would be shocked if Optic didn't get two. So Shotzi
Yeah.
And or Pred getting in. I think Dashy will get in, and
Yes.
if I had to guess, Shotzi will be the other Optic guy. But on my ballot, my imaginary ballot, because I do not actually have a ballot, I would go with Abizi. But again, like you said, it's not a slight. This is a very talented league, the most talented league, at least in my opinion, that we've ever had. At least in top level talent, because we've listed off a dozen players or so that have very legitimate claims to being some of the best ARs or best SMG players in the entire world. It's just a very difficult conversation to put one above the other in a lot of those scenarios. So my proverbial or my hypothetical ballot. ARs, Celium, Scrappy, Dashy, and Ghosty. SMGs, Simp, Hydra, Kleenex, and Abizi. Who are you going with? Obviously, you don't need to, put this in. Like, you can change your mind after this for your official ballot. But who do you think you are going with at the moment?
Yeah, I think I'll update everybody once I actually turn it in, but definitely Celium and Scrap for ARs. I think SMGs I'm pretty content with Simp, Hydra, Kleenex, and Abuzi. The more I'm looking at these stats, obviously shout out breaking point too. I think you could make the argument um, for not including Dashy. Just he's got a 1.06, which is the 10th highest KD, but that's Draza is higher, Attach is technically higher there too. Um, and then Geo and Sib are right below him too. Geo's technically tied with Dashy, and then Sib and Ghosty are right there behind him in 13th, 14th. So I'm not even, I'm kind of second guessing Dashy as well, but I just think he's so talented. Obviously, the popularity factors in for other voters. I'm trying not to think of it from that aspect, but I do think inevitably two optic players, like you said, should make it. So I think I still keep Dashy in there. So I really want to do Ghosty for the last spot. I think right now though I am kind of leaning Draza.
Yeah, he's a good pick.
Celium, Scrap, Dashy, and Draza, and then I just run into that issue of voting for 4 phase players. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I don't really like it. Maybe it's a case, but I don't really want to leave Beasley out too. I'm more torn over this now talking about it than I was even heading in.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll end up going with Ghosty. I think that's a cool story. Do I think Ghosty will probably be an all-star after all this discussion that we're having now
No.
about other potential options? No. Would it be cool if he was? Yes. And playing a small part in that would be kind of neat. So I'm really torn on that 4th AR spot. I think right now though I am leaning Cell, Scrap, Dashy, Draza, Ghosty, potentially sliding in over Draza. And then SMG, Simp, Hydra, Kleenex, Abizi. Maybe if I vote for Draza for 4th AR, I switch Shotzi in for Abizi. But yeah, that's where my head's at right now.
Yeah, I mean, what we think should happen is not how it's going to happen. Because if you look at the last 2 All-Star teams or last 2 years of All-Star teams, I mean, like the least popular player that would have been voted an All-Star would be Sib when he was with Seattle in his rookie year. A lot of times it does come down to not necessarily that it is a popularity contest, but it doesn't hurt to be popular. It doesn't hurt to have kind of like that name value. Like even Attach, who was on Minnesota, who was not necessarily like a big name team or one of like the premier teams of that year, like Attach is a very well-known player. He's a very popular player, and that helps him a lot in regards to that. I simply just don't think that, Ghosty's going to get voted in, but that's what I think should happen. But like you said, it's probably not going to happen. But yeah, the really difficult conversation in regards to the All-Star teams.
And I think that's the easiest out of the 3.
And then let's move on to Rookie of the Year because this was something that we had kind of mentioned offhand throughout the season. There are several candidates for Rookie of the Year. So there's 04, there's Abuza. I think the biggest candidates I would in my mind, Gwen is definitely a very real candidate, despite how poorly Carolina played at times. But he was a very, very good player for the entire year. Abuza, I think I mentioned on maybe the last episode or 2 episodes ago, when they changed his role to something that he was more comfortable with. Obviously, he was kind of playing off role for a good portion of this season after signing with the Seattle Surge. He moves back to a position that he's more comfortable with, and Seattle had a little bit more success. He had more success personally after that, and I think he has a very good argument for that. A player like Linz had flashes of some really good stuff throughout the season with the Minnesota Rocker. Estriel, who I forget the player, I think it was Flames maybe that said it. He said that Estriel should be Rookie of the Year. Obviously, that caught the attention of Abuza, and I'm sure it's caught the attention of some of the other really legitimate Rookie of the Year candidates. And then there's a player like Real, who we mentioned pretty recently how Miami looks a lot better with him in the lineup. Carolina obviously did not get a ton of time with him, and he did not get a ton of time with Carolina, and that gap where he was still figuring out his visa situation between his Carolina and Miami stints, I think that's really going to hurt him. The fact that he wasn't on a team the entire year and he has a smaller resume than a player like Gwynn or Abuza or some of these other players who have had an entire season to kind of prove themselves. So what's your thinking in regards to Rookie of the Year at the moment?
Might go on a bit of a tangent here. I'm going to
Okay.
try to keep this as well organized as I can because it can go in multiple directions. But the way I thought about this was that, again, similar to talking about All-Stars and MVPs, none of the rookies this year have won any titles. So right away, we don't have to worry about that. Then the next thing we have to consider is that rookie's team at champs versus did they not make champs? You have to balance, figure out how much you want to take that into account with their individual stats. The third component, especially for some of these rookies, is how much do you value them playing only a part of the season versus a rookie who's played the full season. Um, in my eyes, I think I said it last episode. I wasn't entirely sold on who I was going to vote for because, yeah, last episode we mentioned the tweet from Flames about Estriel and stuff. Then I looked into the stats, and Gwynn has the ninth highest KD on the season at a 1.07. Obviously, these stats we're getting from Breaking Point. Shout out Breaking Point for all they do for stats and everything for his CDL. Um, Gwynn has a 1.07, the highest of a rookie, ninth highest in the entire league overall KD. Abuza has a 0.99 KD, and Estriel has a 0.97 KD. So those felt like the three main people that a lot of people were talking about. And I know Estriel and Abuza are at champs, but then you have to look at a KD slightly below one that made champs versus the ninth highest KD in the league that didn't make champs. And I am giving the nod to Gwen. I feel like after looking at the numbers, I feel like he's the clear-cut choice right now. So the voting for rookie of the year, the order does matter. You vote 1 through 5, one being your rookie of the year, and then 2, 3 according after that. Notably, though, they did not have Snoopy as an option on the ballot. Don't know if that was an omission or maybe it's because of
It was a
him playing
punishment.
at the end of last year. It could have been some factor because he did play last year. So the options on the ballot are 04, Abuza, Brezzy, Estriel, Flames, Geo, Gwyn, Lucky, Linz, and Real. Um, I really, again, Geo was an interesting one. He had the 12th highest KD at a 1.06, but he didn't play the full year, right? Didn't make champs, so I think that's kind of a knock against him. Even though I'm a really big Geo fan, and I think he played really well this year. Um, so my current thinking in terms of order would be Gwyn as the rookie of the year, followed by Abuza, Real, Estriel, and Linz. I think now that I'm thinking about it, I might do Geo in 5 over Linz. But again, that's kind of a factor of uh, Linz playing the full season and Geo not. Now that I am thinking about it, though, I think I am gonna lean Geo as 5. But yeah, so that's I think for this one it's really tough after you look at Gwen in terms of the order and who you're thinking. But I do think Abuza with a 0.99, you can look at the stats, um, and take the context that you mentioned, like starting the season he wasn't in, uh, his preferred role or the role that he was at the end of the season when Seattle was playing better. So who knows what his stats would have looked like if he had a full season as that main AR. Um, Another guy, I mean, not even mentioned there is 04. Like you can make the case that 04 should get some votes just because like he comes in and Seattle seemingly completely turns things around, and obviously that's in part to the role swap of Abuza too. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of guys here that I think could be getting some votes. I think um, Flames just didn't really play long enough to get much consideration. I think really if you're going to vote for a Heretics guy in one of these slots, it would just be Real over Lucky, simply because of that impact that Real seemingly had on, changing the trajectory of Heretic season. Um, so yeah, that's it. I'm leaning right now. Gwyn, Abuza, Real, Estriel, Gio.
Yeah, so for me, I think I mentioned this last year when we were talking about Ghosty in that Rookie of the Year conversation, because Optic was a lot better when he came into the lineup, but he didn't play the entire season, and I do weigh that very heavily. It's not a conversation that we have when it comes to All Stars because all of those players they play the entire season, so we don't need to have that conversation. But with Rookie of the Year, it's a lot more prevalent because teams are making these midseason changes. They're bringing in Real, for example, with Miami. Gio was brought in after Major 1 with Vegas, and I dock them quite a bit. So like someone like Real played like 60% of the season, where he played the qualifiers for Major 1, did not play Major 1, did not play in the Major 2 qualifiers or Major 2. So he missed half of the majors this season, and he missed one of the qualifiers, so a quarter of the qualifiers. So for me, he's out of my top 5 probably, just simply because I'm weighing him against players like Gwyn, Abuza, players that have had that entire season. But I agree with you at least on that top 2. I would say that Gwyn is the Rookie of the Year, and Abuza is a very close second. I think you could make a very valid argument that Abuza is the Rookie of the Year because he played on a better team. His value was kind of stunted for a lot of this season because he was playing in a role that wasn't as well suited for him, where Carolina seemed to really put a lot of responsibility with Gwyn and were allowing him to play the way that he probably should be playing, which is a credit to Carolina's coaching staff and that team, the way it's constructed and whatnot. But it's a really difficult choice, but I'll go with Gwyn over Abuza and Amuza in second. I would give Estriel probably third because it's between Estriel and Linz for me in third, fourth, and LAG showed up on LAN. They got to champs. Estriel was a big part of that. Like, he was surprisingly good this year. I don't think there was a ton of high expectations for him. But yeah, I think if I had to pick one or the other, I'm going to go with Estriel over Linz. And then probably to round out the top 5, I would take one of the, either Gio or Real, one of the players that played, part of the season. And I think it's probably going to be Gio because he played a little bit more this season. He was very impressive. I think you can make a very good argument that Real and Gio were two of the more impactful midseason acquisitions or midseason pickups. But I would probably go with Gio simply because he came in, I think, after Major 1, so he's played just a little bit more. He played one more major. I think he played about the same qualifiers. And Vegas, I don't know how much of their woes can necessarily be pointed at Gio versus some of the other roster changes that they made that did not really suit them. But that's another conversation. But I think Gio or Real for that 5th spot, I would lean Gio in this case. And 04, I think he didn't play enough. Brezzi, I don't think you can argue that. If you're going to pick one of the other Seattle guys, I think it would probably be 04, just simply because they played a lot better like once he came into the roster. Flames, same what you said. I don't think he could probably be in there. Lucky, no. And I don't know what the deal with Snoopy is. I don't know. His conversation is like a whole podcast episode in itself because he was like the favorite or one of the favorites to win Rookie of the Year. I guess if he was even eligible in the first place. I thought he was. I
Yeah,
thought
I did too.
the ruling was that because he only played champs, they would be eligible for this year. I don't know. Like either way, he was never going to win Rookie of the Year when you are on the second worst team in CDL history. But I think it's weird that we didn't get more clarity throughout the season on that. But yeah, I think Gwyn, Abuza, Estrio, Lins, and Gio probably the top five. But I would go. I think we're pretty solid in Gwyn, which we were
Yeah,
probably leaning toward most of the
yeah,
season simply because week in and week out he was very, very good.
yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a good place to put a pin in it with Rookie of the Year. And now we can transition to MVP, obviously the most important award that we give out all season. We've had who was MVP last year? Hydra was MVP last
Yeah.
year. Celium the year before, or who was? I think it was Celium because it wasn't Celium, and then Simp was a year before that or something like that. And I believe 20 to
The
1.
phase gets mixed up in my head because I just remember with like you mentioned last episode we had the Simp versus
I
Abizi
think that was
debate for
21,
Cold War,
and then
and
Celium was
then
22.
yes, that has to be right because I remember saying I wanted Abizi to win MVP the regular season that year. I thought he deserved it for that. Simp gets it, and then Champs Grand Finals, Celium like popped off. Had like I don't remember the exact KD, but it was like a 1.3 or something absurd. Um, so I thought Celium was gonna get Champs Finals MVP, and Abizi got Champs Finals MVP. But then Celium gets it the following year for the regular season, I believe. Um, so works out in the end for all of them getting MVP in some capacity. Um, but yeah, this one is a real doozy, and I think Breaking Point put up a tweet. I'm gonna put it in the doc just for you now, just because I forgot to put it in here earlier. But it was like of stats for Jordan, LeBron, and Steph when they won MVP, and it's just all of their ridiculous numbers for those individual seasons, and that's kind of the situation we're in for this voting, at least in my eyes. Um, because I think it's a very clear-cut top three in terms of Simp, Scrap, and Hydra. That's not even counting Celium though, so it's weird way of categorizing it. I just think Simp, Scrap, and Hydra are like the the front runners, and it's like the top player in each team. Obviously, Celium has the number one overall KD at a 1.21, so you can make the argument there between him and Simp. Um, but it's real. Like you look at the numbers, Celium's number one, Scrap is number two at KD 1.17, Simp is number three at a 1.14, and Hydra's tied at 1.142. Um, I just, I obviously I've praised Celium for a long time on the show, especially in times where, a lot of the community did not like Celium, whole snaking thing and all that stuff, and people like to say what they want about him, like that reflecting on who he is and as a player and whatnot. I still think very highly of Celium, and I can definitely see you make the argument for him for MVP, but I feel like when the stats are so close for some of these guys, it feels like for me, like Simp was just that guy for FaZe on a lot of occasions. When FaZe was playing really well, it felt like, Simp was the pop off guy. And I don't know. That's my head this year, and possibly, we were just talking about how when Simp did win MVP before, you were the one campaigning for Simp, and I was on a BZ side. Now it feels like roles reversed here, and I'm leaning towards Simp. But right now, I am leaning Simp number one, Scrap two, Hydra three, Cell four. It feels weird having Cell 4 looking at the KDs and the stats directly, but I think that's also similar to like the All Star talk. I can't like just the way Simp, Scrap, and Hydra have played this year. I can't have two FaZe guys as like 1-2 in MVP, or I feel like I can't have two of them without Scrap or Hydra, like separating them in some
Mm-hmm.
capacity. Um, so yeah, that's where I'm leaning right now. I could definitely see the argument for all four of those guys though. Um, as being MVP, and then my fifth for now is Kleenex. That's kind of just like I put him there. Again, he was a Major 1 MVP. I think that's worth mentioning. He's definitely had some really good games, and I think very highly of him as a player. I think it's also worth factoring into for MVP that um, we talked about it last episode where FaZe had the best placings this year of any team when we're looking at all the teams having only one title. FaZe has the championship, 2 seconds and a third. Toronto has the championship, a second and 2/4. And then Optic and New York have those last place finishes. So I feel like if you're picking for somebody else, um, and looking at the consistency of the placings, it feels right to me that if you're going to have another player like on the same team get a shot at MVP voting, that it would be someone from Toronto. The other factor in this vote is I don't have an Optic player voting, so I could see somebody from Optic sneaking in as one of those like fourth or fifth options for MVP, maybe not fourth. But I really feel like the top four candidates for MVP are Simp, Scrap, Hydra, and Celium. That's the order I have right now, but I could definitely be swayed. And we go through these numbers and talk it out. It's kind of scary how strong all four of them have played this year. What the numbers suggest, and I really think you can make solid arguments for all those guys.
So Celium is top KD, Scrap is second, Simp, Hydra third and fourth. BP rating, which is breaking points specific rating. Simp is first, Celium second. Then you have Draza and Abizi. So FaZe are all top four. And then Scrap and Hydra, Pred, Shotzi, Dashy, Kleenex, Insight, Kenny. So, pretty interesting to look at. Obviously, you don't need to use specific stats to kind of back up your argument, but I think if you are to use stats like that, you have a really good argument, like you said, for any of these players. I mentioned, I think it was before Major 4, and obviously I wasn't predicting that New York would win, but I said Hydra was like one of the best players, and like he was proving that if New York was simply better, if they were, they at the time they did not really seem like a true championship contender at that time. But if they were for most of the season, I think he would get a lot more consideration for MVP. And I'm considering, putting him as the MVP in my hypothetical ballot. Obviously, he played very, very well all season long. But New York, and this will be the downside, New York did not play very well or as consistent as some of the other candidates. And that it can play a major factor here. If you're looking at FaZe, they are by far the most consistent. They are every single year. They are the top team in the regular season. For at least in CDL history, Atlanta FaZe has been the best, most consistent team in the regular season. So if you're going on that, then Celium or Simp is a very good pick. Toronto, I think Scrap was very clearly their best player. So he's kind of in that Hydra category where that team or those two teams have very definitive best players that are not carrying them necessarily, but they are by far the best, and they will get the lion's share of the credit when they do well. And then there's Optic. And like I mentioned when I was doing the All-Star stuff, that play or their performances of late, that plays a factor into how I view them. That's probably not fair because they did play well for 75% of the season, but they played so poorly that I don't think it can be simply ignored, like I mentioned earlier. And the difference between Optic and, say, a team like New York, who also had a very bad performance at the beginning of the season, New York, I think, was the first seed or maybe the second seed heading into Major 1. And then they obviously had their horrible showing and they get top 12 at Major 1. But Optic was the last seed heading into Major 4, and they lost their first round matchup at Major 4. That that doesn't happen to MVP players, in my opinion. FaZe, they had their really bad performance in Cold War. I think at the last major they got like top 8 or something, which was kind of an abomination for them. But in comparison, Optic obviously did much worse than that, and they have been horrible over the last month or month and a half. And that's why I can't really justify, maybe a top 5, like a 4th, 5th, probably 5th. But I can't say that any of them deserve to be MVP on a real legitimate basis. So I'm going to probably go Hydra number 1. But man, if they announce tomorrow or whenever they're announcing it, I don't know when they will, but if they announced
Amps probably
Simp or Celium or Scrap, they win MVP, I'd be like, that makes a ton of sense. I have no problem with that.
I feel.
I would probably go Hydra 1 by a very slim margin, probably the slimmest margin that when we've done this. Maybe Simp and Abizi, because that was a very weird argument that we were trying to put out. But I would say Hydra 1, maybe Simp 2, Celium 3, Scrap 4, and then probably, you put Kleenex at 5. I think that's a good, probably be a good option. Maybe you put, if you want to put an Optic player, you put Dashy or you put Shotzi. I'm not entirely sure. It's like that is a different conversation, and that's one we didn't really have to have in the All-Stars, because Dashy and obviously Shotzi and Pred are different roles, so we don't have to compare them directly, all 3 of them. But which of the 3 you wanted to put, if you had to put one of those in the MVP? But I don't know. I'll leave the 5th one open. I have no idea, to be honest. But yes, Hydra, Simp, Cell, Scrap, and then some person for 5th.
I put Optic guy down for you for 5th.
Just like all 4 of those players formed into one would get my 5th spot.
Yeah. I think I'm in, now that we've talked about it a little bit, I kind of am like in a spot where I'm not entirely sold on who to vote for. I still think I'm leaning Simp for MVP, but after like the fact that there is the debate around it makes it more clear to me that end of the day, regardless of who I vote for here, it could very likely just be one of those other guys, right? Like you said, like if I vote for Simp and I wake up tomorrow and it's Scrap or it's Celium or Hydra, I'm gonna be like, that totally makes sense. I can see the argument for those guys. So I don't think there's much to this. Well, I think there's a lot to discuss in terms of what everybody else sees and how they're also thinking about this MVP and weighing these guys against each other and their performances. How do you factor in the individual stats versus the placings and all that stuff that we've been talking about? Would love to hear other people's thoughts on that too. But yeah, I think we probably will never know the actual like voting unless they share it on the broadcast. But if they did like show a breakdown of the votes for MVP, I wouldn't be surprised if this was like the closest it's ever been in terms of like between first and second, or even like we've been saying, make the case for it being the closest 1 through 4.
Yeah, and the reason is because there's no tiebreaker like usual. One more championship, and you're like, all right,
exactly.
We'll just give the edge. Like it's all kind of on an even playing field, and like the only thing with FaZe guys, and they're the only team that we usually have to even talk about with this, is how do you break apart their individual value, especially when 2 of them are MVP caliber people. So obviously Simp and Celium are they're going to be 2 of the top 5 MVP candidates most likely. Do you dock one of them or both of them and say, well, you play with another MVP caliber guy and Hydra doesn't and Scrap doesn't, or maybe he does if you want to consider Kleenex a guy, but like, you could say that, and that's I'm sure that could play a factor, but um, I think, like I said, you can make a great argument, a very valid argument for any one of pretty much the top four guys. And if people are mad, then they were always going to be mad regardless of what happened. For me, I'm very content with any of Hydra, Simp, Cell, or Scrap winning MVP. They're deserving. They were the four best players in my eyes this season. And if you wanted to throw a dark horse of not someone who would win, but I shouted out Kismet earlier. Players like Kismet deserve a lot of credit. Like, he's a very valuable, if you just simply wanted to look at the value of a player, he's very valuable to a championship team. And we've seen that in the past before with players, a player like TP during Complexity. Like, he was never going to win like a season MVP if they had it, but it's very, he's a super valuable and necessary person to win championships. So he should be noted for that.
I will say, I mean, Kismet got Champs MVP last year.
I think for an event, it's more doable. For an entire season, I think the stats play such a much larger factor over an entire year.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, congrats to everybody involved. If the All-Stars, Rookie of the Year, MVP, a great season for many of these. Well, all the players that we mentioned had pretty much great seasons. I'm sure great can change in their definition, considering getting to champs or not. Which for a lot of the rookies, obviously they did not make it to champs, and that's unfortunate. But it's been a great season, and we're almost done. So this is probably it is our second to last episode of the season, and then obviously we'll talk about stuff after the season is concluded. I think we'll probably hold off on any kind of champs preview talk until next episode, because we're about an hour 15, hour 20 into this episode. But I would like to eventually talk about some of those teams that didn't make champs, just to kind of put a bow on what their season was and maybe preview what they should be doing and obviously with Esports World Cup, we will have some kind of like lead up point, something that we're building to. So maybe we'll talk about it when we get to that point. But very cool season, very fun season, although it was at times kind of trying with the online qualifiers, with the extended qualifiers. But we're almost done. Next week, we will be back with our champs preview. We will be talking about the 8 teams. We'll break it down and we'll talk about each of the 8 teams in some varying format. I'm sure we will not give as much attention to certain teams, and they might not get equal time, but we will talk about each of them nonetheless. But we will be back next week. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, Ego Chall Podcast on Twitter, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast if you wanted to catch the live stream of the podcast. When we go live, it'll most likely be Sunday or Monday evening. Next show, again, depends on when we are able to fit it into our respective schedules, but sometime July 14th, 15th, somewhere around there, we'll be back with a new episode and be talking about champs, the final event of the year and the most important event of the year, of any year, when we're talking about Call of Duty esports. Make sure to like and subscribe and follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening, watching on. We're on YouTube, Twitch, like I said, Apple Podcast, Spotify, all that good stuff. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Really appreciate it. If you guys after, excuse me, if you guys after listening to Preston and I debate over All-Star Rookie of the Year MVP, if you guys have any thoughts on who you'd vote for or what you think, who you think's deserving of any of those accolades, let us know in the comments, and maybe we can read some off before or after our champs preview next week. But yeah, other than that, looking forward to champs and can't wait to do the preview show next week. It's always the champs recap is probably my favorite episode, but champs preview and then any major preview recaps follow right after that. So one of my favorite shows of the season coming up next week. Hope you guys enjoy it too. And Can't wait to see you there if you're here. So until then, remember, send the chell.